For heaven's sake, Julia, you're not folding those napkins properly." The shrill voice of my mother-in-law, Marian, pierced through the kitchen like a hot knife through butter. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and counted to 10 before turning to face her. "Marian, I've been folding napkins for dinner parties for 20 years. I think I know what I'm doing," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. She huffed, her clipped silver hair bouncing as she shook her head. "Well, clearly not. Here, let me show you the right way." Before I could protest, Marian had snatched the crisp linen napkin from my hands and began refolding it with exaggerated movements. I bit my tongue, reminding myself that she was still grieving. It had only been 3 months since her husband Frank had passed away, and Brian had insisted she move in with us temporarily. 3 months that felt like 3 years. "Mom, leave Julia alone. She's got everything under control," Brian's voice came from the doorway. I shot him a grateful look, but Marian barely acknowledged him. "I'm just trying to help, dear. After all, this dinner party is important for your promotion, isn't it?" Marian said, her tone sickeningly sweet. Brian sighed. "Yes, but—" "Then we want everything to be perfect," Marian interrupted, beaming at her son. "Now, Julia, about the menu. Are you sure you want to serve that salmon dish? It's so common." I gritted my teeth. "The salmon is Brian's boss's favorite, Marian. We've discussed this." "If you say so, dear," she replied, patting my arm condescendingly. "I just hope it's not too fishy." As Marian bustled out of the kitchen, I turned to Brian, my eyes pleading. He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around me. "I'm sorry, honey, I know she can be a bit much," he murmured into my hair. I pulled away, looking up at him. "A bit much? Brian, she's driving me crazy. How long is temporary going to last?" Before he could answer, our daughter Ivy burst into the kitchen, her pigtails flying. "Mommy, Grandma says I can wear my new party dress tonight." I frowned. "Ivy, sweetie, we talked about this. That dress is for special occasions, not dinner at home." Ivy's face fell. "But Grandma said—" "I don't care what Grandma said," I snapped, immediately regretting my harsh tone as Ivy's eyes welled up with tears. Brian knelt down beside her. "Hey, Pumpkin, why don't you go put on that pretty blue dress we bought last week? You look like a princess in that one." Ivy nodded glumly and trudged out of the kitchen. I sank into a chair, feeling defeated. "I'm sorry, Brian. I didn't mean to snap at her." He squeezed my shoulder. "It's okay. We're all under a lot of stress right now." Just then, Marian's voice rang out from the living room. "Julia, did you move my antique vase? I can't find it anywhere." I closed my eyes, counting to 10 again. "I'd better go deal with that," I muttered, standing up. As I walked into the living room, I froze. Marian was standing there, holding the shattered remains of her precious vase. Her eyes were blazing with fury. "What have you done?" she hissed. "I didn't touch it, Marian. I swear," I stammered, my heart racing. She advanced on me, pieces of porcelain crunching under her feet. "Don't lie to me. You've always been jealous of my things. You probably did this on purpose." "Mom, that's enough." Brian's voice boomed from behind me. "Julia would never do something like that." Marian's face crumpled, and she burst into tears. "Oh, Brian, your father gave me that vase on our 25th anniversary. It's all I have left of him." As Brian rushed to comfort his mother, I stood there, shell-shocked. How had a simple dinner party preparation turned into this nightmare? And how much longer could I endure living under the same roof as Marian? Little did I know this was just the beginning of a storm that would tear our family apart and push me to limits I never thought possible. The morning after the disastrous dinner party, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring at the pile of bills on the counter. My hands shook as I sorted through them, the numbers blurring before my eyes. How had things gotten so out of hand? "Oh, Julia, you're up early." Marian's voice startled me. I quickly gathered the bills, trying to hide them from her prying eyes. "Just getting a head start on the day," I replied, forcing a smile. Marian peered over my shoulder. "Are those bills? My goodness, there are so many. Brian can't possibly be okay with all this spending." I felt my cheeks burn. "Our finances are none of your concern, Marian." She clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "I'm just looking out for my son's best interests. You know, when I was managing our household." "Mom, please," Brian interrupted, entering the kitchen. "Julia's got it under control." Marian huffed but retreated to the living room. Brian wrapped his arms around me from behind. Don't let her get to you, honey. We're doing fine. I leaned into him, wishing I could believe that. The truth was we were struggling. Between Ivy's school fees, the mortgage, and now the added expense of having Marian living with us, our savings were dwindling fast. Actually, Brian, I started, turning to face him, I think we need to talk about our budget with your mother here. Mommy! Ivy's excited voice cut through the tension. She bounded into the kitchen, waving a glossy catalog. Look what Grandma gave me. Can we order this dollhouse, please? I took the catalog, my eyes widening at the price tag. Sweetie, this is very expensive. We can't afford. Oh, don't be such a killjoy, Julia, Marian chimed in, following Ivy. Every little girl deserves a beautiful dollhouse. I'd be happy to contribute. I gritted my teeth. Marian, we've talked about this. You can't keep buying Ivy expensive gifts. Well, someone has to spoil her, Marian retorted. Lord knows you're too busy pinching pennies to give her any treats. That's enough, Brian's voice boomed, startling us all. Mom, I appreciate your generosity, but Julia and I make the decisions about Ivy's upbringing. And Julia, can we please discuss our finances in private? Ivy's lower lip trembled. So, no dollhouse? I knelt down, pulling her into a hug. Not right now, sweetheart, but how about we make one together? We can use that big cardboard box in the garage. Ivy's face lit up. Really? Can we start now? After breakfast, I promised, relief washing over me as she skipped away. Marian sniffed. Cardboard. How quaint. I ignored her, turning back to the bills. Brian, we really need to talk about this, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know, but can it wait until after work? I've got a big presentation today. Before I could respond, he kissed my cheek and hurried out the door. I stared after him, feeling more alone than ever. Throughout the day, Marian's criticisms continued to pile up. She questioned every purchase I made at the grocery store, scoffed at my attempts to mend Ivy's clothes instead of buying new ones, and even had the audacity to suggest I get a real job to contribute more to the household. By evening, I was at my breaking point. As I stirred a pot of soup, our third meal of leftovers this week, Marian hovered behind me. You know, Julia, she began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, I couldn't help but notice how worn out Brian looked this morning. Perhaps if you were more frugal with the household expenses, he wouldn't have to work so hard. The spoon clattered against the pot as I whirled to face her. That's it, Marian. I've had enough of your constant criticism and meddling. This is my home, my family, and I'm doing the best I can. Marian's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed dangerously. Well, I never. Is this how you repay my son's generosity? By disrespecting his mother? Mommy? Grandma? Ivy's small voice came from the doorway. Why are you yelling? As I looked from my daughter's confused face to Marian's smug one, I realized with a sinking heart that this battle was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. I woke up with a knot in my stomach, dreading another day of Marian's constant criticism. As I padded downstairs in my worn bathrobe, I heard her voice floating from the kitchen. Honestly, Brian, I don't know how you can stand it. Your wife lounging around in that ratty old thing. In my day, we made an effort to look presentable, even at home. I froze on the stairs, my cheeks burning with humiliation. Brian's response was too quiet to hear, but Marian's shrill laugh cut through the air like a knife. Taking a deep breath, I squared my shoulders and marched into the kitchen. Good morning, I said, forcing a smile. Marian's eyes raked over me, her lips pursed in disapproval. Oh, Julia, I was just telling Brian how a little effort goes a long way in keeping the spark alive in a marriage. I bit my tongue, pouring myself a cup of coffee. Brian cleared his throat awkwardly. Mom, please. Julia works hard taking care of our home and Ivy. Of course, dear, Marian patted his hand. I'm sure she does her best. The backhanded compliment stung, but I refused to let her see how much she was getting to me. Instead, I focused on making Ivy's lunch for school. As I spread peanut butter on whole wheat bread, Marian peered over my shoulder. Oh, is that all you're giving her? When Brian was little, I always made sure he had a hot, nutritious lunch. A growing child needs proper fuel, you know? I slammed the knife down on the counter. Marian, I appreciate your concern, but I know what's best for my daughter. Well, excuse me for caring about my granddaughter's well-being, Marian sniffed. I suppose in this modern age, convenience trumps nutrition. Before I could retort, Ivy bounced into the kitchen. Morning, Mommy. Morning, Daddy. Morning, Grandma. Marian's face transformed into a mask of doting grandmother. Good morning, sweetheart. Are you ready for your big day? I frowned. Big day? Ivy's eyes widened. Oh, I forgot to tell you. Grandma's taking me shopping after school for a new outfit for picture day next week. My heart sank. Ivy, honey, we talked about this. We can't afford new clothes right now. You have plenty of nice things to wear for pictures. Marian waved her hand dismissively. Nonsense. Every little girl deserves to feel special on picture day. It's my treat. I felt my temper rising. Marian, we've discussed this. You can't keep undermining our parenting decisions. I'm not undermining anything, Marian replied, her voice sickly sweet. I'm simply being a loving grandmother, something you wouldn't understand given your background. The room fell silent. Even Ivy sensed the tension, her small face creased with worry. What's that supposed to mean? I asked, my voice dangerously low. Marian's eyes glittered with malice. Well, dear, it's no secret that you didn't have the most stable upbringing. I'm just trying to give Ivy the advantages you never had. I felt like I'd been slapped. How dare she bring up my past? Before I could respond, Brian stepped between us. That's enough, Mom. You've crossed a line. Marian's face crumpled into a look of hurt innocence. I'm only trying to help. If you'd rather I not be involved in Ivy's life at all. No, Grandma, Ivy cried, throwing her arms around Marian's waist. I want you to take me shopping. I stood there, feeling utterly defeated. Brian shot me an apologetic look, but I turned away, unable to bear his pity. Fine, I said, my voice hollow. Take her shopping, but this discussion isn't over, Marian. As I walked out of the kitchen, I heard Marian's triumphant whisper to Ivy. Don't worry, darling. Grandma will make sure you have the prettiest dress in the whole school. I clenched my fists, a newfound determination rising within me. This woman had invaded my home, criticized my parenting, and was now trying to buy my daughter's affection. Something had to give, and soon. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. I stood in the doorway of Ivy's room, my jaw clenched as I surveyed the chaos before me. Scattered across the floor were piles of new clothes, shoes, and toys, all with price tags still attached. In the center of it all sat Ivy, happily playing with a brand new tablet. Ivy, honey, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, where did all this come from? She looked up at me, her eyes shining. Grandma took me shopping again. Isn't it great, Mommy? My stomach churned. This was far beyond a simple picture day outfit. I picked up a designer dress, the price tag making me wince. Sweetie, this is too much. We can't keep all of this. Ivy's face fell. But Grandma said I deserved it. She said you and Daddy worked too hard to give me nice things. Before I could respond, Marian appeared behind me. Oh, Julia, don't be such a spoilsport. A grandmother is allowed to spoil her only grandchild, isn't she? I whirled to face her. Marian, this is completely out of hand. We can't afford. You can't afford it, Marian interrupted, her voice sickly sweet. I, on the other hand, have the means to give Ivy the life she deserves. The life she deserves? I repeated, my voice rising. What's that supposed to mean? Marian's eyes narrowed. Well, dear, let's be honest. Your humble upbringing hardly qualifies you to understand the finer things in life. I'm simply ensuring Ivy doesn't suffer the same limitations. Her words hit me like a physical blow. I glanced at Ivy, who was watching us with wide, confused eyes. Ivy, sweetheart, can you go downstairs for a bit? Grandma and I need to talk. Once Ivy was out of earshot, I turned back to Marian. How dare you? You have no right to undermine our parenting or make decisions about what Ivy needs. Marian laughed, a cold, brittle sound. Oh, please, I've seen how you struggle to make ends meet. Face it, Julia, you're in over your head. Ivy deserves better than hand-me-downs and budget meals. We provide everything Ivy needs, I hissed. Love, stability, values. Things money can't buy. How quaint, Marian sneered. But in the real world, dear, money talks. And right now, I'm the one with the means to give Ivy a proper future. I felt something snap inside me. This ends now, Marian. I want you out of our house. Her eyes widened in mock surprise. Oh my, such hostility. I wonder what Brian would say if he knew how you were treating his poor widowed mother. As if on cue, I heard the front door open. I'm home, Brian called from downstairs. Marian's face twisted into a triumphant smirk. Well, why don't we ask him? She brushed past me, heading for the stairs. Panic rose in my throat as I followed her. I couldn't let her twist the situation to her advantage. In the living room, Brian was hugging Ivy. He looked up as we entered, his smile fading as he sensed the tension. What's going on? Marian's eyes welled with tears. Oh, Brian, I'm afraid there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Julia seems to think I'm overstepping by buying a few things for Ivy. A few things? I sputtered. Brian, you should see Ivy's room. It's like a department store exploded in there. Brian looked between us, confusion etched on his face. Mom, we talked about this. You can't keep buying Ivy expensive gifts. But darling, Marian simpered, I'm only trying to help. You work so hard and Julia, well, she does her best, I suppose. I felt my face flush with anger. That's it, Brian, I can't do this anymore. It's me or your mother. She has to go. The room fell silent. Brian's eyes widened in shock while Marian gasped dramatically. Ivy, sensing the tension, clung tighter to her father's leg. Julia, Brian said slowly, you can't be serious. She's my mother. Where would she go? I stood my ground, my heart pounding. I am serious, Brian. This is our family, our home, and I won't let her destroy it. As I looked at the faces around me, Brian's shock, Marian's smug defiance, and Ivy's confusion, I realized I had reached a point of no return. Whatever happened next would change our family forever, and I was ready for it. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching the small handmade photo frame Ivy had given me for Mother's Day last year. It wasn't much, just popsicle sticks glued together and decorated with glitter and seashells, but it meant the world to me. Inside was a picture of Ivy and me, both laughing, our faces pressed close together. It was my anchor in the storm Marian had brought into our lives. Julia? Brian's voice called from downstairs. Can you come down for a minute? I sighed, placing the frame carefully on my nightstand before heading down. In the living room, Brian and Marian sat on opposite ends of the couch, both looking tense. What's going on? I asked, my guard immediately up. Brian cleared his throat. Mom and I have been talking, and we think we've found a solution to make things easier for everyone. Marian nodded, her face a mask of concern. We know things have been difficult, dear, so I've decided to move out. For a moment, relief washed over me. Then I saw the glint in Marian's eyes and my stomach dropped. That's good, I said cautiously. Where will you go? Brian shifted uncomfortably. Well, that's the thing. Mom's found a nice little apartment nearby, but it's a bit more than she can afford on her own, so you're going to help her pay for it, I finished, my voice flat. Marian reached out, patting my hand. Now, Julia, I know money's tight, but Brian assures me you can manage. After all, with me out of the house, you'll save on groceries and utilities. I pulled my hand away, fighting the urge to scream. Brian, can I talk to you in private? In the kitchen. I rounded on him. Are you serious? We can barely afford our own bills, and now you want to pay for your mother's apartment? Brian ran a hand through his hair. I know it's not ideal, but what choice do we have? We can't kick her out on the street. She has money, Brian, I hissed. All those expensive gifts for Ivy, she can afford her own place. Mom says that was the last of her savings. Brian explained. She was just trying to do something nice for Ivy before. I cut him off. Before what? Before she guilted us into supporting her? Brian's face hardened. That's not fair, Julia. She's my mother. I can't abandon her. And what about us? I asked, my voice breaking. What about our family? Before Brian could answer, we heard a crash from the living room. We rushed back to find Marian on the floor, Ivy's photo frame shattered beside her. Mom, Brian cried, helping her up. Are you okay? Marian whimpered, leaning heavily on him. Oh, I'm so clumsy. I was just trying to look at that lovely picture of Ivy, and I must have lost my balance. I knelt, carefully picking up the pieces of the frame. My heart sank as I realized it was beyond repair. I'm so sorry, dear, Marian simpered. I know how much that meant to you, but really, it was just a childish craft. Perhaps now you can get a proper frame for that beautiful photo. I looked up, meeting Marian's eyes. In that moment I saw the truth, the calculated malice behind her innocent act. She hadn't fallen. She'd destroyed my precious gift on purpose. Julia? Brian's voice was concerned. Are you all right? I stood slowly, the broken pieces of the frame clutched in my hands. No, I said quietly. I turned to Brian, my decision made. I want her gone, Brian. Not to an apartment we pay for. Gone. Or I swear, I'll take Ivy and leave myself. The room fell silent. Brian looked shocked, Marian's face a mix of triumph and fear. and in the doorway stood Ivy, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. I knew I'd just lit the fuse on a powder keg, but I couldn't back down now. Something had to give, and I was determined it wouldn't be me or my family. Whatever came next, I was ready to fight. The tension in the house was unbearable. Brian had retreated to his study while Marian locked herself in her room, playing the victim. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands shaking as I tried to piece together Ivy's broken photo frame. "Mommy?" Ivy's small voice startled me. She stood in the doorway, clutching her favorite stuffed animal. "Are you and Daddy fighting because of me?" My heart broke. "No, sweetheart. Come here." I pulled her onto my lap, holding her close. "This isn't your fault. Grown-ups sometimes have disagreements, but we'll work it out." Ivy's eyes fell on the broken frame. "Is that the present I made you?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, but don't worry. I'll fix it." Her little face scrunched up in confusion. "But I saw Grandma break it." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean, honey?" Ivy fidgeted, looking down. "I saw Grandma pick it up and throw it on the floor. She looked angry. Then she called for Daddy and pretended to fall." I felt a rush of emotions, anger, vindication, and a fierce protectiveness for my daughter. "Ivy, this is very important. Are you absolutely sure that's what you saw?" She nodded solemnly. "I'm sure, Mommy. Grandma lied." Just then, Brian walked into the kitchen. "What's going on?" I stood up, setting Ivy down gently. "Brian, Ivy has something to tell you." As Ivy recounted what she'd seen, Brian's face went through a range of emotions: disbelief, shock, and finally, anger. "That can't be true," he muttered. "Mom wouldn't." "I'm not lying, Daddy," Ivy insisted, tears welling up in her eyes. Brian knelt down, hugging her. "I believe you, sweetheart. Why don't you go play in your room for a bit? Mommy and I need to talk." After Ivy left, Brian turned to me, his face pale. "Julia, I don't know what to say." Before I could respond, Marian's voice rang out from the doorway. "Well, I certainly have something to say. How dare you turn my own granddaughter against me?" I whirled to face her. "We didn't turn anyone against you, Marian. Ivy saw what you did." Marian's face contorted with rage. "You little liar! Brian, surely you don't believe this nonsense?" Brian stood, his voice quiet but firm. "Mom, Ivy has no reason to lie. But you've been manipulating us from the start, haven't you?" Marian's eyes widened, then narrowed dangerously. "I see. So this is how it's going to be? You'll choose your wife's delusions over your own mother?" "They're not delusions, Mom," Brian said. "I've been blind to it, but Julia was right all along. You've been trying to drive a wedge between us since you moved in." Marian laughed bitterly. "Oh, please. I've only ever wanted what's best for this family. If Julia can't handle a little constructive criticism, that's hardly my fault." "Constructive criticism?" I exploded. "You've undermined me at every turn, spoiled Ivy rotten, and now you've destroyed something precious to me out of spite." "You can't prove anything," Marian hissed. "Actually, we can," Brian interjected. "I installed security cameras last month after that string of break-ins in the neighborhood. I never thought I'd need to check them for something like this, but—" Marian's face drained of color. You spied on me?" Brian shook his head, looking pained. "No, Mom. We trusted you, but now I think it's time we saw the truth." As Brian left to retrieve the footage, Marian turned to me, her eyes blazing with hatred. "This isn't over, Julia. You may have won this battle, but I promise you'll regret the day you ever crossed me." I stood my ground, meeting her gaze. "No, Marian, you're the one who's going to regret ever trying to destroy my family." The sound of Brian's footsteps returning made us both turn. He stood in the doorway, laptop in hand, his face a mask of shock and disappointment. "I've seen enough," he said quietly. "Mom, I think it's time you left. For good." As Marian's face crumpled in defeat, I felt a mix of triumph and sadness. We'd won, but at what cost? The family was fractured, trust was broken, and the road to healing seemed impossibly long. But as I looked at Brian, seeing the determination in his eyes, I knew we'd face whatever came next together. The storm wasn't over, but for the first time in months, I could see a glimmer of hope on the horizon. The silence in the house was deafening. Brian sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, while I paced the floor, my mind racing. Marian had locked herself in her room after Brian's ultimatum, and we could hear her muffled sobs through the walls. "What are we going to do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Brian looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "I don't know, Julia. I never thought. I mean, she's my mother." How could she do this to us? Before I could respond, we heard a crash from upstairs, followed by Ivy's scream. We bolted up the stairs, our hearts pounding. Ivy stood in the hallway, tears streaming down her face, pointing at Marian's room. "Grandma's throwing things," she cried. Brian tried the door, but it was locked. "Mom," he shouted, pounding on the wood. "Open the door." Another crash, followed by the sound of breaking glass. I pulled Ivy close, shielding her. "Brian, we need to get in there. She might hurt herself." He nodded, then stepped back and kicked the door. It splintered open, revealing a scene of chaos. Marian stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by broken knickknacks and torn photos. In her hand, she clutched a small object I couldn't quite make out. "Mom," Brian said softly, approaching her like she was a wounded animal. "Put it down. Let's talk about this." Marian's eyes were wild, darting between us. "Talk? There's nothing to talk about. You've made your choice. You've chosen her over your own mother." I stepped forward, still holding Ivy. "Marian, please. This isn't about choosing sides. We just want what's best for everyone." She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "What's best? You want to throw me out on the street after everything I've done for this family." "Everything you've done, I couldn't hold back anymore. You've done nothing but criticize and undermine me since the day you moved in. You've tried to turn my own daughter against me." Marian's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful little—" She raised her hand, and I finally saw what she was holding. A small, ornate letter opener that had belonged to her late husband. Brian lunged forward, grabbing her wrist. "Mom, stop! This isn't you!" As they struggled, I pushed Ivy behind me, my heart racing. Suddenly Marian wrenched free, the letter opener slicing through the air. I felt a sharp sting on my cheek, and warm blood trickled down my face. The room fell silent. Marian stared at the blood on the letter opener, her face a mask of shock. Brian looked between us, horror etched on his features, and behind me Ivy began to sob. "Oh God," Marian whispered, the letter opener clattering to the floor. "What have I done?" Brian moved quickly, grabbing a towel and pressing it to my cheek. "Julia, are you okay? We need to get you to a hospital." I nodded, still in shock. As Brian guided me out of the room, I heard Marian's broken voice behind us. "Brian, I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" He turned, his voice cold. "Save it, Mom. We're done here. When we get back, I want you gone. Do you understand? Gone." As we made our way downstairs, Ivy clinging to my side, I felt a mix of emotions washing over me. Relief that the confrontation was over, fear for what the future held, and a deep, aching sadness for the family that had been torn apart. In the car on the way to the hospital, Brian reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm so sorry, Julia, for everything. I should have seen it sooner. I should have protected you and Ivy." I squeezed back, wincing at the pain in my cheek. "We'll get through this, Brian. Together." As we drove into the night, I knew that while one chapter of our lives was ending, another was just beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in months, I felt hope blooming in my chest. Whatever came next, we would face it as a family, stronger and more united than ever before. 6 months had passed since that fateful night. The small scar on my cheek had faded, but the emotional wounds were still healing. As I stood in our freshly painted living room, I couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed. The doorbell rang, startling me from my reverie. Brian appeared from the kitchen, squeezing my hand reassuringly before opening the door. There stood Marian, a shadow of her former self. Gone were the designer clothes and perfectly coiffed hair. Instead, she wore a simple blouse and slacks, her gray hair pulled back in a modest bun. "Come in, Mom," Brian said, his voice neutral. Marian stepped inside, her eyes darting nervously around the room before settling on me. "Julia," she said softly, "thank you for agreeing to see me." I nodded, my throat tight. This was the moment we'd been building towards for months, the final confrontation, the chance for closure. We settled in the living room, an uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. Finally, Marian spoke. I don't know where to begin. What I did was unforgivable." "Yes, it was," I replied, my voice steady. "You nearly destroyed our family, Marian." She flinched at my words, but nodded. "I know, and I've spent every day since then trying to understand why I did it. The therapist I've been seeing, she's helped me see how my own insecurities and fears drove me to lash out at you." Brian leaned forward. "That's no excuse, Mom. You hurt Julia. You manipulated Ivy. You—" "I know," Marian interrupted, tears welling in her eyes. I know, and I'm so, so sorry. I've been working hard these past months. I got a job at the local library. I've been volunteering at the senior center. I'm trying to be a better person, to make amends. I studied her face, searching for any sign of the manipulative woman who had tormented me for so long. Instead, I saw genuine remorse and a deep, aching sadness. Marian, I said slowly, I appreciate your apology. But you have to understand, trust isn't rebuilt overnight. It will take time, a lot of time, before we can even think about having you back in our lives in any significant way. She nodded, wiping away a tear. I understand. I don't expect forgiveness, Julia. I needed you both to know how sorry I am, and that I'm committed to changing. Just then, we heard the patter of small feet. Ivy appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening at the sight of her grandmother. Grandma? She said hesitantly. Marian's face softened. Hello, sweetheart. You've grown so much. Ivy looked at me, uncertainty in her eyes. I nodded, giving her permission to approach. She walked over to Marian, studying her carefully. You look different, she said. Marian smiled sadly. I am different, Ivy. I've learned a lot about being kind and respectful. I'm sorry for the way I behaved before. To my surprise, Ivy reached out and patted Marian's hand. It's okay, Grandma. Mommy says everyone makes mistakes sometimes. The important thing is to learn from them. I felt a lump form in my throat at my daughter's wisdom. Brian caught my eye, a mix of pride and love in his gaze. As Marian prepared to leave, she turned to us one last time. I know I have no right to ask this, but is there any chance someday that we might be able to start over? Brian and I exchanged a look. After a moment, I spoke. We can't make any promises, Marian. But if you continue on this path, if you truly commit to change, maybe, someday, we can try to build a new relationship, a healthier one. Marian nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Thank you. That's more than I deserve. As we watched her drive away, Brian wrapped his arm around me. You okay? He asked softly. I leaned into him, feeling the strength of our bond. I am. For the first time in a long time, I really am. Ivy tugged at my hand. Can we have ice cream now? Brian and I laughed, the tension finally breaking. As we headed to the kitchen, I realized that this wasn't just an ending, it was a new beginning. We had weathered the storm, emerged stronger, and now, finally, we could start to rebuild. Not just our family, but ourselves. And that, I realized, was the sweetest revenge of all. Living well, on our own terms, free from the shadows of the past.